There's an old expression that says, by their fruits ye shall know them. And I think sometimes, the validity and the importance of that is overlooked. And what that kind of does is it refers to history and it refers to heritage and it refers to the kind of qualities that generation and individual and institution, company depicts that kind of tells you what they are about. Well, I'm so happy today to kind of tie into that expression, by their fruits you shall know them, by talking about a family who has phenomenal fruits in our community for over 100 years, really. And that's the Duval family. And I'm so happy to have one of the family members, one of the descendants of the original creator of Paul Duval and Son Upholstery, which is none other than Thomas Duval. And because of his heritage and because of his family's familiarity, Dr. Thomas Duval has continued the Duval's involvement in the history of the community, the growth of the community, and the education of the community. So I thought it would not be robbery, frankly, to have him on the show to talk some about his family, talk some not only about the Duval's history, but talk about history. He's also a history guru, if I may call him that, uh, because he's very, very attuned to and involved in history and the historical elements of our community, as well as his family and as well as education. So, he's done a lot. A lot of people don't know it. He's kind of behind the scenes sometimes, but he deserves the recognition because of the initiatives and the involvement that he has personified really over the years. So take it away to Dr. Thomas Duval.
I want to express my gratitude for you having me on your show, and I want to commend you for the things you've done in the past, but most recently, all the various places that you're putting on your show about our wonderful history here in Macon and Middle Georgia. I think it speaks well for what we need to do as the senior citizens, but it's also very important for our young folks, and it's very much related to business because I think we have a long history of business in Macon and Middle Georgia, and we have a lot of folks that want to go into business, but unfortunately, they haven't done very much in terms of learning from the icons from the past. And so I'm going to just speak a little bit about my family, but try and make it relevant to what young folks should consider from a historic point of view, uh, at looking at their history and what they can glean from that and use from that. My great grandfather, Paul Duval Sr., was born, let's see, he was born February 1863. Okay. And I've been to a few places where some young folks, I tell them he was born a slave, and I tell them the date, and they said, uh, Dr. Duval, I think you misspoke because we we were emancipated January the 1st, 1863. You said he was born a slave. They said we were emancipated. I said, no, that's very important. I'm glad you know that date. That's wonderful, but you got to get the rest of the story. You see, we weren't really emancipated until the Union Army got there in that particular area and stayed. Okay? So we weren't really emancipated until we got the 13th Amendment and they abolished slavery. in a lot of places. So it's important for our kids to learn the rest of the story and appreciate from whence they came. In 1883, my great grandfather, well, he had uh, started a business here. He had actually started working here in Macon around the 1870s, and he worked in the Willingham Mattress Company plant, and he learned some skills in that plant, and he opened his upholstery shop down on the lower part of Cotton Avenue in a little shed. And eventually he moved up to the part that's across the street from the Walton building. In that building, which had been a moving company. And so when he started the business, he was actually in the moving company, upholstery company, and then later on, he did a lot of awnings. I think it's important to remember the era that we're talking about and look at your baseline because, you know, that's 1883. That's what, 20 years after, emancipation, so to speak, and a little less after slavery. And yet he was able to start a business here in Macon, Georgia, and it lasted well over 100 years or so. And he survived. So I think for young folks, I think they should be asking, well, how was he able to do that? And why did it last as long as it did? And then what happened? Um, I think one of the things to consider then and now is the era you live in, because you got to assess your market. Okay, you got to figure out your market. And what he had figured out back then was that Southerners, they love their ancestry and they love the furnishings there because they could define their whole family tree based on their furnishings. And so what he was able to do was to learn a skill that recovered or reupholstered their heirlooms that they cherished and they wanted to keep. Now, a lot of that is not the way it is today. We don't tend to keep a lot of things, and you need to discuss what we call built-in obsolescence. We actually manufacture things, and we manufacture them to break. An example is your phone. They stopped making it where you could take the battery out of your phone because they want you to buy a new phone. They don't want you to get it fixed. So you have to look at your market and figure out, in the words of what is it, Marvin Gaye, what's going on, with your market and what you can do that has value with your market, and you have to consider your competition. Well, um, my grandfather's goal was to educate his kids. My great grandfather's goal was to educate his kids. And my grandmother and grandfather went to Haynes Institute over in Augusta, which was Lucy Craft Laney's school. And of course, our kids don't know that Lucy Craft Laney is from Macon, Georgia, and her father, David Laney, rang the bells of emancipation.
Hmm.
So all these things matter, I think, in terms of your historic background and your market when you're considering uh, putting a business in a certain location. I think you need to have that as your baseline to consider when you're developing your market strategy to figure out what your customers appreciate, what their history is, what their children may or may not appreciate from the past, but you got that relevance to analyze and gain a perspective on how you can get into that market. Because that's exactly what my grandfather, or I should say my great grandfather and great grandmother and grandfather and grandmother did. Now, the whole history of Haynes Institute, I think, is a fabulous history. And by the way, what was it? Mr. Hutchins Sr., he was down there at Haynes. I got pictures of my grandfather and Hutchins. I may have sent those to you, by the way, down there at Haynes Institute together. And
Wow.
my grandmother, I think they kind of hooked up then because my grandmother got a normal degree from there, which allowed you to teach at that time because you could go to a high school basically and you had an additional term and you could get a normal degree. And that's what they called it at those times. Those were normal schools. For example, the Ballard Normal School here in Macon, Georgia, had that normal program in it too. So at first it was you could just go to high school and take that part of the program. Then it got to be 1 year, then maybe 2 years, and then it gradually got into where it was a 4 year degree. But anyway, she took that. But the business started, like I say, in 1883, and it started in a time of segregation, and things were not wonderful at that time. But here's the irony, and I tell kids this, and they don't tend to get it. There's an era called the nadir, 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 which was called the low point. And Dr. Logan came up with this term, but it was the heyday of very bad race relations. And it was actually the heyday of lynchings and so forth. And some of the oldest uh, coming together in the community here in Macon, Georgia, was anti-lynching groups that came together to work on that problem and so forth. But here is the business irony of it all. During that era, um, it was called the progressive era, but it wasn't really progressive for us in many ways. But here's the interesting thing. It was when we had the biggest growth in Black businesses and Black colleges. Now, when you really start thinking about that, there are some connections that might be relevant even today in terms of, what we're dealing with and how we negotiate and figure out a path forward. But it's ironic and paradoxical that that was the case, but I think the discussions around that would be helpful in terms of strategy for how we deal with a very complex market. The other thing that I'm really working on now is that I think the biggest problem that we got in the Black community today is our reading level. Depending on which state, which school district, for African American males, it's only between like 10 to 21 to 22% graduate reading at 12th grade level. That's something that we've really got to do something about. Uh, we've done a nice job of getting more kids to graduate, but they don't read at 12th grade level. So in the business community, when it comes time to get a job, Mr. Havsham, when they pull out a test on the applicants, our boys, particularly our boys, they don't tend to do very well.
Hmm.
And that's not just here in Macon, Little Georgia. That's all over the United States. So that is something that we really, really got to work on. And Brother Havisham, you know that the data around the failure rate of businesses,
Hmm.
For all businesses, for the first year to a year and a half or so, is around, 30 to 40%. But for African American businesses, it's around up to 80%. It seems to me what we need to be considering is analyzing our potential entrepreneurs in terms of their reading skills and to be providing some programs around looking at their ability to read and understand financial reports and a whole lot of other things that they need to be able to do in terms of comprehension so that they can get prepared for those small businesses. Because you are well aware that small business is not easy for anybody, but you definitely need to have those kinds of skills available, particularly in this age. And the reading problem for the boys, it's so bad till we don't have a lot of boys that can pass the ASVAB to get into the Army because they can't read. And then if you compound that on behavioral problems, then you have a lot of people that are virtually, left, so to speak, obsolete out in the world because they can't cope. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen with this artificial intelligence. I'm telling you one thing, though, it is a powerful, powerful tool. But what I do know, the little I do and have played with, I do know this about artificial intelligence. Number one thing for Black folk is our history and culture, for the most part, is not out in a lot of the databases that it uses. So when you ask it something about Vining Circle, the historic value of Vining Circle, it'll say basically it doesn't have any historic value because they don't have that information about Vining in the database. But what I do know about artificial intelligence is this. If you formulate the question correctly, and if there are databases out there, it does, in many cases, a fabulous job of putting that information together. But the relevance, the real relevance for African Americans is this, is simply this. I don't know everything that's going to happen around artificial intelligence, but I know this. You got to be able to read at 12th grade level to use it. That's just a fact, you know. And so that's what I've been working on is coming up with some strategies that will work for our kids to develop what's called the letterbox area of the brain, and that's graphene phoneme development of that brain site so that they can learn to read. And they're supposed to accomplish this by like third and fourth grade. And if they don't get it in, for the most part, they don't tend to get it. That means the number of people that you're going to be looking at that potentially could take on going into business, taking on that monumental task of going into business and all the complicated things associated with it, that pool is going to be relatively small. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this big gap in terms of the success rate. May not be the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons. So I think all of that is relevant in terms of, what we should be looking at because critical information uh, for professional documents, for example, business law, business licenses, uh, your product, for example, could be very simple. It could be something like making a hamburger or something like that. But the market analysis is where you're going to need these skill sets. And so I think if we could come up with some kind of program that's going to enhance that deep reading skills and use financial analyses as the teaching thing for a lot of potential entrepreneurs, I think that would be a wonderful thing. Because let's say, for example, you got some young folks that are interested, but let's say you got some boys that are interested, but they're not where they're supposed to be. Okay, we can't use third and fourth grade materials to train those kids because they're juniors and seniors, for example. But what we could do is integrate those reading skill sets in a program that talks about market analysis around going into business around something that they would enjoy doing. That's a real strategy when you think about it. And that's what we got to start thinking about. And I think will make a big difference in terms of the success rate and keeping these boys on track so that they don't get derailed and get off into, things that they shouldn't be doing. And I like a little feedback on that if you would. What do you think about that strategy?
Well, it makes perfect sense. And what I'm trying to formulate in my mind is, I mean, I'm in total agreement, is what can we do to kind of initiate and formulate programs, initiatives, and activities, because that's a conversation for a later day. But I'm glad that you are imparting that information to prick the conscientiousness of the community. And then it not only applies to business failure, but it also applies to citizenship failure. It applies to educational failure. It impacts the crime rate.
Mhm.
And so I'm just glad and seeing people don't understand, they don't really look at it from that perspective as it relates to, because in order to address them, you got to look at cause and effect. And the cause of many of these problems, as you have so eloquently presented, is the inability to read. So what I think is that everybody, I'm very concerned about people not understanding that we all got a responsibility. We all got a role to play. And so I would solicit impact and information and suggestions as it relates to that, because in order to really address it, there has to be some kind of, and then maybe you could come up with the program, but then there has to be participation and buy-in and things of
Right.
that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think. I really, really appreciate your research and your observations as it relates to that. And I'm going to be very conscientious as it relates to it. And then if I can come up with something, or, at least we can get the information out there. Hey, one of the problems in our community that our kids can't read, particularly African American boys, and what can we do to kind of address it? Maybe churches and the Boy Scouts and other nonprofits need to incorporate, that into what they are doing to try to improve the community. So I would certainly share this with many of the nonprofits, particularly the ones that deal with youth. And then maybe you can think in terms of some kind of program, that can be utilized, that can be packaged to kind of, give to these institutions and nonprofits and organizations to utilize and apply. So I agree with you. I really appreciate your deep thoughts as it relates to that. And this won't be the last connection, if you please, that I'll have with what you're trying to do and what you have stated is the problem. It's deep and it's real, but it can be addressed if we lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And
Mm-hmm.
that means helping the community, and everybody got a role to play. That's
Right.
what I emphasize in my series on Black economics. You know what I tell them, don't just stand there, do something.
So
So I'm really appreciative of what you're doing. And then I'm going to give you just, we got about a minute left, but talk a little bit about your coloring book.
here's the last edition that I did. It was sponsored by the Knight Foundation, and I do plan to put some more iconic figures in here. I tell folks, especially the adults, I tell them this is the cliff notes of our history before making Little Georgia. Uh, we've got a lot of folks in this little book here, and I love for an older person to read it and let the younger person color the pictures, but also share the rich history here. Motivation is that key ingredient that we have not done a good job of in public schools. Motivating our kids to want to learn, motivating them to want to learn to read and to do the hard science of reading work to learn to read. And our history, our iconic mentors, this is where we can get that foundation for motivation and for them to develop a purpose in life. And if they want to be entrepreneurs, that's their purpose in life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duval. This is a call to action, and we've had the absolute pleasure of listening to Dr. Thomas Duval talk not only about his family, but also about an approach to trying to improve our community through development and an enhancement of reading skills, particularly among African American boys. So we'll be talking more about this, Dr. Duval. I will be giving some thought to it. And I really appreciate, man, I really appreciate your interest, your dedication, and your research in thinking that it will not be robbery to utilize whatever resources you have to improve our community and continue the legacy, the rich legacy of Paul Duval and Sons upholstery company that
Mhm.
started well over 100 years ago by dynamic members of your family. This is a call to action. Having interviewed Dr. Thomas Duval, DDS. Have a great day.
www.makingblackpages.com.